there was more of a general sense of frustration that this has been planned and just moving at kind of a glacial pace, and that there hasn't been real money put behind it or real effort to lay out a strategic vision for where Australia thinks it should go in the future.
You're listening to the USSC Briefing Room, a podcast from the United States Study Centre at the University of Sydney, where we give you a seat at the table for a USSC briefing on the latest developments in US news and foreign policy. We'll cover what you need to know and what's beneath the surface of the news.
Hello, I'm Jared Monshine, the Director of Research at the US Study Center, and thanks again for joining us for another episode of the USSC Briefing Room. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're recording on today. The University of Sydney is located on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. The war in Ukraine was a pretty big wake-up call for a lot of nations around the world as they quickly saw that this crisis could consume the national supply of a number of critical munitions. The Australian government addressed this in their 2023 Defence Strategic Review and the 2024 National Defence Strategy, and through the prioritization of the guided weapons and explosive ordnance and acceleration of this GWEO enterprise. However, these aspirations are a long way from reality, and sort of bridging the gap of where we are now to where we want to be is a really big focus that we have here at the US Study Center. So there are a lot of questions. How depleted are munition stockpiles after Ukraine? How does GWEO address Australia's defense needs? And what can Australia learn from others about how to stand up this new production capacity? So to discuss this all, we have a fantastic guest who recently joined us in Sydney. Her name is Stacey Pettyjohn. She's the Senior Fellow and Director with the Defense Program at the Center for a New American Security. And she has done extensive research, wargaming, and strategy work around defense issues, including drones, nuclear deterrence, and, relevant for today's discussion, munition stockpiles. She also participated in the USSC's recent GWEO activities in Australia. So, thanks so much for joining us, Stacey. I just want to confirm that we're going to get your number or stat at the end of this episode. Is that right?
That is absolutely right. I'm really excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. All right. So to get things started, I guess I'd love to know just very briefly your background, just your interest in this. Where how did you get into this? What not too long ago was a bit of a niche field.
Sure. So I'm a political scientist by training and one who focused on foreign policy. But then I went to the RAND Corporation and got into defense analysis and wargaming. And I have landed on, since I've been at CNAS, a host of issues that are interrelated and are connected by two themes. I'm interested in the future of warfare, but I'm really interested in what we can do now. And this is where munitions and posture and some of the less exciting topics have floated to the forefront of my agenda because it is focused on sort of things and capabilities that we have and that are within our control, where we could make investments that would dramatically improve the US military's ability to deter aggression. While we're also simultaneously developing future technologies to make sure that we can maintain deterrence over the long term.
Fantastic. I was recently reading your article in Foreign Policy, the title, "The Pentagon Isn't Buying Enough Ammo." And you highlighted, the contrast between the rhetoric versus what's actually being available in substance in terms of munitions production. But one thing that I found is, I was just saying how it seemed a bit niche not too long ago, but I didn't realize until I read your article that even in the 1999 air war in Kosovo and the 2014 operation against ISIS, those operations nearly exhausted U.S. stores of key precision weapons. I had no idea. Was that even in the news at the time?
It was, but it was at least for 2014 for sure, because the Air Force had basically used almost all of its JDAMs, the direct attack GPS guided weapon that can be attached to any bomb, to make it smart, and most of its Hellfires, which is a short range air to surface missile. But it, I think, has not been recognized because people pay attention to one conflict and don't think about it across time. In the 2011 NATO intervention in Libya, it wasn't the U.S. quickly transitioned to a role where it was supporting air operations, but NATO allies almost ran out of munitions in that situation too because they were planning to rely on the U.S. stockpile. So this has been a persistent issue, and it's due to some structural issues in how the US budgets and sort of service priorities that end up resulting in ammunition always getting sort of short shrifted in the budget process, and the idea that we'll make up for it next year, and that never really materializes.
Yeah, I've never seen so much coverage of this until the Ukraine conflict, though, and that's where it's endless in terms of the questions about the munitions. And at this point in time, have what is the main lesson that you think we've learned from Ukraine, and do you think that officials are actually learning about it, or it seems like it's just endless catch up, not mustard?
I mean, there are a lot of lessons, and I think people glom onto the ones that most align with their pre-existing beliefs, as they're prone to do so. I think the ammunition expenditures really have shocked the world and the West, the NATO, and close U.S. allies as a whole, because it is the scale of them. While in the counter ISIS campaign, Operation Inherent Resolve against ISIS in Iraq and Syria, there were a lot of munitions used. It was over a long period of time. Here, the intensity is greater every single day. And you're seeing that both sides would basically use what they have in terms of artillery shells. The Russians quickly expended a lot of their long range cruise and ballistic missiles, the most sophisticated ones, and started pulling out some of their older systems or using ones for missions that they were not optimized for, like surface to air missiles for land attack. And I think the international community as a whole that is supporting Ukraine and resisting Russian aggression has realized in the course of supporting Kyiv that they don't have that much to provide, and that their stockpiles quickly reached levels that was concerning for them. So you're looking at now most of Europe needing to rearm and realizing that it's taking a long time, and the United States even realizing this, though it's for select munitions, not every single system, because Ukraine has mainly been provided with short range ground attack munitions more than anything else, and surface to air missiles to defend its airspace.
What are the implications of that, of just running out? What does this look like on the ground, and what can or should be done about it, do you think?
I think the implications are that the conflict, it protracts. And my colleague Andrew Metrick has written about protracted war. He has a great report called "Rolling the Iron Dice" that dives into this, and he says is this sanctuary of mutual exhaustion. And you haven't seen a full sanctuary, but you see these periods where the intensity of the fighting wanes a little bit. And then it goes back up when each side is able to reconstitute, and when they have more. Russia's really ramped up and is continuing to ramp up its production of ammunition and drones, which sort of blur the line, some of them, between ammunition or missile and an uncrewed aircraft. While Ukraine has struggled as it's relied on the international community to support it, and including the United States has been unable to provide the levels that it really needs, that it's ever been able to have firepower superiority. So I think as you look at this, there has been this realization that for the many decades since the Cold War ended, that the international community has been a little bit um, lax about the security requirements, and sort of made assumptions that have proven not to be true about the nature of conflict and the level of stockpiles that it needs. And they need to revise these going forward to make sure that they're prepared so they don't find themselves in a position where they're out of their key ammunition. And that could drive them to a lot of really terrible decisions where you're using less favorable things. Maybe you're procuring cheap things, like Russia got the Shaheds from Iran to
The
supplement its,
drones.
yeah, the Shahed 136. It's his long range attack drone that is using to supplement its cruise and ballistic missiles. Um, it could also drive countries towards unconventional weapons like nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, if that's all you have left in your stockpile. So I think you want to make sure that you have a robust conventional deterrent so that you don't end up in that situation. And if an adversary thinks that they can outlast you, you're potentially in a really disadvantageous position and may end up uh, encouraging aggression indirectly.
I guess especially if that adversary has a lot more people, is not a really well functioning democracy, and has lots of North Korean artillery supplies also bolstering them as well, in addition to
Yeah,
Iranian help.
North Korean artillery, North Korean short range ballistic missiles, the Kim Skander. It's not proving to be awesome, but it's okay and it's filling gaps. So, and the Russians are okay with that.
Yeah.
And a lot of countries probably would be.
One thing that I also really liked about your piece in foreign policy is how you highlighted the expense of actually taking down some of the what I imagine are pretty cheap drones that the Houthi rebels are flying. Um, our colleague here at the Study Center, Tom Corbin, talked about the many millions of dollars spent just shooting down some pretty cheap drones in the Middle East. Could you maybe expand on that and what why is that happening and what can be done about that exactly?
Sure. This is really a cost competition. And I'm going to include some of the drones, at least the loitering munitions or the kamikaze drones, the one way strike ones, as a form of sort of the cheapest form of attack that we've seen in the close fight and deep fight for long range. So the Houthis are using some of these. They also have pretty cheap ballistic and cruise missiles. And what you're finding is that air defenses have proven to be quite effective. So, active air defenses, surface to air missiles that are radar guided and can intercept incoming attacks, they're doing a great job. On both the Ukrainian and the Russian side, you're seeing that they have proven to be worth their while. But the missiles and the interceptors in particular are quite expensive, especially the US ones. You're looking at like the PAC 3, the Patriot missile, and if it's the MSE version, it's not cheap. You have the standard missile series going from the SM2, the SM3, the SM6, and these are millions of dollars each. And if you're using a couple $1 million missile to shoot down a couple $100,000 drone or cheap missile, that cost exchange ratio is not in your favor. And you're going to sort of, in the long run, an adversary can use a strategy of exhaustion to just sort of deplete your stockpiles. And that's really problematic because you need to have deep inventories. You've seen this as a problem for Ukraine as its long range SAMs have run low of ammunition, that there have been more and more attacks on the cities and on deep targets within their country by the Russians, and they don't have the ability to stop them. And Russia is also starting to encroach with its air force, which has not been incredibly effective in this fight, but they're going deeper over the front lines. Not really deep, they're still close to the front line, the FLOT, but they are using glide bombs, and that's providing them with another advantage because Ukraine doesn't have enough of the air defense interceptors to defend frontline forces and sort of the cities and deeper targets like air bases farther back. So air defenses are really important. Right now, the ones that we have are really, really expensive. And I think there needs to be a more affordable mix that is developed and pursued. Like the US Navy is looking at, they've been using sometimes their 5-inch gun to shoot down some of these systems, but it's not really geared for that right now. And fully integrated into the Aegis system where it's accurately targeted. So there are efforts underway to develop a more precision guided 5-inch, cannon round, basically, that would be a more affordable option. And then in the long term, you have higher technology solutions that are being developed in terms of high powered microwaves and directed energy, lasers that could be used that could provide a cheaper per shot sort of value, but have a lot of upfront cost in terms of research and development, and the technology has not proven to be mature yet.
Yeah, seeing the stats on that, just on the millions versus a few 100,000, it reminds me of what Bin Laden said after 9/11. We are, I think the quote is, "We're continuing this policy and bleeding America to the point of bankruptcy." Right? It's
Yeah.
like that's it.
Well, the U.S. Navy said in between, I think, October and like February or March of this year, so October of last year and February, March of 2024, they'd spent $1 billion on weapons in the Middle East. And some of those are offensive systems too, because they launched Tomahawks at some of the Houthi missile sites, but that's a lot of money.
Yeah, it really is, and the question is just how sustainable is that? Now, pivoting closer to where I am, and specifically on GWEO, this Australian effort, the guided weapons and explosive ordnance enterprise, and why is this significant? Do you think to Australia's defense strategy? And maybe did you learn anything about it in your time in country here in Australia?
I did. I learned a tremendous amount. So GWEO is really interesting because it predates Ukraine, which sort of shows that Australian strategists were reading the writing on the wall in terms of recognizing that they needed more missiles and munitions to face emerging threats than a lot of other countries were. But the other fact that really stood out was just how little's been concretely achieved thus far. And GWEO has many aspects. So I think it's worth giving credit where it's due and pulling those apart a little bit, because a key from the beginning in all of its incarnations, GWEO has included buying more precision guided weapons from foreign suppliers. And you've seen that there has been a good bit of that going on since the beginning of the enterprise announcement. But it's been in somewhat of an ad hoc manner that doesn't look like it's really connected to the broader enterprise. And in particular, the part that is focused on developing a sovereign manufacturing capability within Australia for precision guided weapons. So
Is that
it
important
is the
to have a sovereign
well,
manufacturing, and why?
I think it is. And well, from my perspective as an American, I think having a trusted allied defense industrial base is important. The US can't meet the demand that we face right now in Ukraine, let alone you throw in the Middle East. And when you start thinking about China and planning for that, nor can any other country. So countries who are like-minded and who have, deep enduring relationships, I think need to work together on this and figure out ways where together the sum can be more than the whole of their parts. We've seen there have been a lot of problems with supply chains. COVID really revealed this, I think, for the Australians, and this was part of the impetus for having a sovereign capability, was recognizing that you don't want to have to rely on someone else or end up being at the back of the line if there's a whole bunch of orders that, say, the United States or any other country has for a particular weapon. You want to assure your access to it when you need it. And so that is important for the sovereign piece. On the supply chain piece and sort of the defense industrial base side of things, you've seen that the industrial base in the United States and Europe and Australia is pretty fragile. Australia doesn't have an ability to produce by themselves precision guided weapons right now. The US has one, but it is very thin. There are a lot of single source suppliers, there are a lot of bottlenecks in the supply chain, and the sub tier suppliers for a lot of the components and some of the materials are really sort of long poles in the tent. We've seen, in particular, solid rocket motors being a problem. There are only two producers in the United States, major producers right now. There are some new upstarts, Anduril, Ursa Major, other companies that are moving into this space, but it is really dominated by two companies, and every single precision guided weapon missile needs a rocket motor. So the US can't meet demand right now. So trying to think about how you can work with allies and partners where you go beyond just co-production, where like the US, it's a US missile, US designed, we send the parts, it's assembled somewhere else. That's what I think happens a lot of the time right now. And that's just going to stretch your supply chains further instead of making them more robust. It does provide you with weapons forward, which is an advantage, but I think there are probably better ways you could go about this where you try to alleviate some of the choke points with strategic sort of redundancy in terms of parts of your supply chain, not the entire thing, and then you build the same weapon, which provides you with, the golden child of interoperability, interchangeability, as uh, the British Admiral Radican had said. So there are a lot of potential benefits there, but it also helps. Well, it is sort of increasing integration from an American perspective. At the same time, from an Australian perspective, it provides you with more assurance or more sovereignty and ability to access and readiness of certain weapon systems.
I like the strategic redundancy. That's what I'm going to start calling the extra set of clothes I put in my kids' backpacks. Um, in
That's just
turn,
smart parenting because you know they're going to get.
yeah, exactly. Um, do you find like in your time here in talking with Australians about GWEO, do you feel like Ukraine has been a wake up call for them? I know that the like Taiwan and how they've taken some lessons from what's going on in Ukraine. Do you feel what are those lessons that Taiwan is taking, and what lessons do you think Australia should be taking in terms of how it approaches GWEO?
So I didn't get a sense from a lot of the conversations that Ukraine was driving Australia's ambition for GWEO, and that might be just a biased sampling of who I spoke with, where it can plug in with other allies because it needs to, whatever missiles it decides to build in Australia, it probably needs an international market for them as well because the ADF's requirements aren't going to be enough to sustain that industry over the long run. And part of this is creating that sort of foundational human and manufacturing capital, having that in Australia so that it can grow and evolve as munitions needs change. So I didn't feel like Ukraine was quite as big of an impression there. I think for Taiwan, it certainly is. And a lot of it has revolved around drones, which are closely related to some missiles. I think here, Taiwan, I actually have a report coming out next week on this, swarming the strait, that Taiwan is in a disadvantageous position right now because it does not have a strong drone industry. It has some, but relatively few military drones. And they also are in not going to have access to the commercial market the way the Russians or the Ukrainians have, because most of those drones are Chinese made. They're DJI or Autel drones. And that's not going to be usable for Taiwan. And certainly they're not going to be able to replace the ones that they have the way that either side in the current conflict has, nor are they going to be able to get a lot of the cheap subcomponents, whether it's cameras or antennas or radios that are fueling the first person view drone sort of phenomenon in Ukraine right now, where both sides are just using these cheap commercial products to make these MacGyver do-it-yourself drones that go and crash on a target and cost like $400 or $500 each, which is ridiculously cheap. They're short range, they're not like a panacea, but I think Taiwan has a lot of thinking to do, but it could really use drones, especially with precision guided weapons. It's long been noted that if Taiwan were to make itself a porcupine by having different rings of defenses with precision guided anti-ship missiles, that it could make an invasion something that's very costly. It could also really throw a wrench in the plans to blockade it. And if it coupled those with a robust mobile air defense network that would help protect its forces, you can just imagine how difficult it would be when you couple it with the terrain and having to cross the strait, everything else. And if you add drones that are targeting some of those missiles, providing an update and making sure they're more likely to get and hit an incoming ship or a landing craft, that would be, I think, a very robust deterrent. But Taiwan's a long way from that right now. They have acquired and produced some missiles, but a lot of them are more land attack than anti-ship, and they obviously need a lot of them if Ukraine and other conflicts are any indication of sort of the numbers that are required.
I guess it seems like a lot or certain quarters have seen Ukraine as a wake up call, and it really has galvanized focus on this really pressing issue. But I guess what, based on your time in Australia and your research on these topics, your world leading wargaming on these issues. I should highlight is really fascinating the wargame that you did for the Select China Committee in Congress, and that had it was really impactful. In the think tank game, there's no higher compliment than saying something was impactful, and I don't think you could have been more impactful with that war game that you did for them. But what is your recommendation for sort of how Australia could realize and actualize GWEO at the end of the day?
I think that Australia needs to weigh a number of competing factors. And I know there's sort of a crawl, walk, run approach, and the announcement thus far has been an initial tranche of Gimlers, which is not something that the ADF um, is likely to put high on its prioritized list, given the threats that were identified in the last strategy and the Defense Strategic Review. But I think that is a good stepping stone. And if Australia can develop some key components of that, like, for example, solid rocket motors, that could really be useful on the world market, not just the United States, but other countries that need them and are trying to figure out ways to quickly bolster their production ability, and could lead to further weapons. It seems like if I had to guess, that the next step would be the Prism missile, and I think that's a fine choice. It could be useful for the ADF, but I think over the long run, Australia is going to want to balance between searching for the highest technology, which is going to have a really limited market, and finding weapons that would be useful for it, potentially the United States and other like-minded countries in the Indo-Pacific. So looking at, maritime strike weapons is important. I know some folks have talked about the Naval Strike Missile or the JSM, the air-launched variant of that, which the F-35 can carry internally. That would make sense, right? Like, that's a more accessible weapon where there's probably a bigger market. I fear that there's a hope that, like, Australia is going to move down this golden road towards more and more exquisite weapons, whether it's like longer range Prism Increment 4, which again could be very useful, but again is probably not going to be licensed to be sold to many countries. And so you're not going to produce that many. So maintaining warm production lines is going to be a challenge. And if you get into hypersonics, no country's going to be able to buy that many of them. The US isn't, certainly not Australia. So that might be a capability that, in my view, I think the ADF would be better off purchasing than trying to actually build and assemble, because it's just going to be really hard to sustain. I would be looking for some more of those middle range capabilities and to focus on producing in Australia some of the components that are flexible, like the rocket motor facilities. You can change them to make different size rocket motors of a particular type, so you can service multiple different types of missiles. That gives you some agility in terms of production and ability to hedge against uncertainty and changes in the environment. So I would also say, like, air defense missiles would be really, really good, and there the technology, I think, is more closely guarded. But even things like NASAMS, which aren't going to be as long range, but certainly something like SM2 could be like a longer range ambition for a high end weapon that would be really, really useful, would have a global market, and would help Australia and the United States and other countries in the Indo Pacific.
So Australia should not only think about its own military uses, but also the global market and what's actually relevant to the global markets. Um, I mean, if North Korea, like weapon manufacturing, is relevant to the global market at this point, then you have to, maybe not aim for the Ferrari or Lamborghini of weapon systems. Awesome, thank you so much, Stacy. I think at this point, I would love to get your stats or your figure that you think is relevant to today's conversation.
Okay, so this was one of my most surprising things that came out of my trip and that I learned. So GWEO has been talked about. There's been a lot of excitement about it and discussion. But when you actually look, there has been only $37.4 million contracted, and this is for this initial batch of Gimler's production of 820 million plan. So that's only 4.5% of the approved plan. And then if you look at the investment strategy that came out with the new Australian defense strategy, it aspires to spend a total of $21 billion on GWEO. So that would mean right now Australia has spent less than a fraction of a percent on the entire guided weapons enterprise. And I think that hopefully the government's going to pick up the pace now that the strategy has been out and they have, a chief who's in charge of the entire enterprise. They're going to lay out a plan and sort of really actually achieve what the Morrison government said they were going to do in like 2021 and accelerate towards domestic production, because all of these things with the defense industrial base take time to set up and just don't move that quickly.
Fantastic. I mean, that was fantastically insightful. I don't know if that was a fantastically optimistic and positive note to end on. But thank you so much for really giving us amazing insights into this complex challenge. As we wrap up, I just want to point out a couple other podcasts that may be of interest. Our CEO, Michael Green, is co-host of the Asia Chessboard podcast with Ju Blanchette, the Friedman Chair for China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I also want to recommend checking out the USSC Live podcast series, which runs recordings from our major live events, including our 2024 election watch kickoff. And you can find these on our website, ussc.edu.au, or wherever you get your podcasts.